It's really important to focus your energy on where am I going to start and how can I start to build a bit of strength and put a bit of a footprint down in that place before I try and reach to, go into other states or service other states and other localities, because there can be tax implications, admin implications. And so I think when my clients go a bit wrong or struggle is they're just trying to do too much over a massive expanse of land. And so
Yeah.
it is basically try and do something well in one space, in one spot, and then build on that.
My first podcast guest is actually not a designer. It's a lawyer. Manori de Silva is a lawyer based in the US. She happens to be a Brit, but what she does, she specializes in helping entities establish themselves in the US market. So if you're a small, medium agency anywhere in the world, and you have plans to do, look for clients, connect with brands in the US as a growth opportunity, you're going to love this podcast. Real practical advice about what steps to take, what are the things you need to do in order to establish yourself and make that first connection, aside from your creative studio itself. So have a listen to this, see what you think, some amazing takeaways, and hopefully we'll see you here one day. Right, okay, let's get straight into this. Manori, hi, just give us a quick wave. We're gonna sort of come back and understand your story in a second. But the first question, as it relates to a creative entity outside of the US, they have a perception of the US, and they may think, well, this is how clients are. But what's the big difference between the world that you've seen at large and the US market as it relates to clients working transatlantically or globally or working domestically? What are those big differences in a nutshell?
Understood. So I think America is huge. I mean, it's the size of Europe, so there are differences. It's not a monolith, and I think it's difficult to pigeonhole all Americans as being one way. It matters where you do business, and cities can be different depending on where they are in the country. So you kind of have to know which kinds of people are more likely to buy your product. And one of the things that is really, I think, very different here in America is the customer service level. And you do see that in a comparison, like if you go to a restaurant in many places in Europe, people might not tip very much, but you have very much a tip culture in the US, and that is across all, that client service is really embedded in how Americans see products. They may come back with many more questions on, can you do this? Can you modify that? And they expect you, as the person delivering the service, to be flexible and to be interested in working to get the product that
Do
they
you think
want.
then, if I roll into the second question, you're partly answering it, but in order for an organization to survive working in the US market, imagine their first year, what are the things that maybe as a checklist, 1, 2, 3, three things, one of them might be service orientated, really stepping into that role, but anything else that you think in terms of that first 365 days of an entity, and it maybe is about survival at that point to see if you can get through?
I think because to my original comment, America is vast. One of the things that I see clients of mine struggle with is they try and cover too much ground in their first months or year, and they're trying to do things in geographical places scattered all over the US, and it can be draining on resources. So I think it's really important to focus your energy on where am I going to start and how can I start to build a bit of strength and put a bit of a footprint down in that place before I try and reach to, go into other states or service other states and other localities, because there can be tax implications, admin implications. And so I think when my clients go a bit wrong or struggle is they're just trying to do too much over a massive expanse of land. And so
Yeah.
it is basically try and do something well in one space, in one spot, and then build on that.
Great. I want to come back to locations and focus and that sort of, like, as you say, that sort of narrowing the aperture to succeed in that one place before we go crazy all over the US. But I think if I remember first coming to the US about 97-ish, I think we felt the US needed X, but they actually needed Y. Meaning, there's a sort of a perception, and we've got a great portfolio. We're going to have, loads of clients, and we're going to do it this way. But the nuances of working here, fast forward 25 or more years, what we think might be X could still be. We have a great portfolio, great client list. We've been around 15 years or more, but actually, you need to think about this as soon as you come into the US.
I think that's true. I think, times can change, wants can change, consumers can change. And I think one of the things that I always recommend is try to talk to somebody who's on the ground before you launch, and somebody who's in the industry. And what's very fortunate today is we have this great technology like Zoom, and you don't necessarily have to fly out, but use your contacts to try and talk to people who are in the industry on the ground here, and get a gauge of, are people buying this now, or are they doing this now? And using your contacts to get the best picture you can before you commit to a particular route, because maybe it's a product or a service that's just not going to work in that place at that time.
Well, that's great. These little sound bites, these little kind of small things. It's also a fantastic segue, I think, into introducing your background, because you're a specialist in the legal world at helping organizations establish themselves in the US. So we'd love to hear more about that, and also the journey that clearly you don't have a US accent like me, but your journey was also very creative. So love to sort of like just spend a minute just on your current role and your journey to get here in the US.
Thank you, James. So as you know, I'm a lawyer these days, and I'm a partner at a firm called Clark Hill, which is, they have, it's a big firm, has about 700 attorneys spread out all over the US, and an office in Dublin, Ireland, and Mexico. They do have an international outlook, but I've been here for about 14 years in the US. I come originally from Sri Lanka, but I grew up in Britain, you can hear from my accent, and I grew up in North London, went to school there, and then had the opportunity to go to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to work just as in my gap year as an au pair. And I ended up staying in the Netherlands for 10 years and studying at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague. I studied sound engineering and music, and became a sound engineer after that. I did post-production for commercials, I wrote a bit of music and things like that for commercials before I moved back to England, went to law school. I worked in London at a law firm in London, and then I came to America. But you and I have talked about this before, that I'm always very grateful for the first half of my working career, where I was surrounded by creatives, musicians, dancers, designers, architects, and it's something that I treasure very much, because I value the gift that art gives to us, to the world. And I think that it's very important that creative people are supported in a way that is, that the professionals like us, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, we also need to understand how creative people think, instead of just trying to impose our sort of corporate approach to everything. So I value very much that time that I had with all facets of creative people.
Okay, well, firstly, I'm going to look forward to you writing your memoir. That's going to be a very interesting read. But everything you've just said there to a sort of a creative audience, and everybody needs the professional services. We need our accountants, we need our lawyers, we need the people that actually hold the business together. But also, I think, as a creative entering a new market, to connect with someone like yourself, who is not just appreciating the arts, but has actually lived, to your quote, the first half of your career in that space, is a comfort kind of level that you understand us in that sense. So everybody who's listening, details will be given at the end of this podcast on how to get connected with Manori, but you can see there we've got someone on this side who's really helping industry, but creative industries come through. I'm going to switch over now to the other side of our fence, the client side.
Yeah.
And, we've touched on briefly customer service, but maybe just picking up that phone. You mentioned a Zoom call, so we can all do that. We can all DM someone and try and sort of, create a sort of a sense of a narrative. How should people outside of the US, not just Europe, right, internationally, consider the first step of, if they've not already done that, connecting with clients? And are there any sort of do's and don'ts, I suppose is what I'm saying?
I think it goes back to my first point of use your referrals, even if it's one person that you remember, okay, I remember they sold something to an American customer. It's worth reaching out to that person and saying, what was your experience? And, do you have any tips? There are two buckets, the professional help, and then what do customers want at this moment in time? The professional help, again, it's critical that you use referral sources before you hire a lawyer, a banker, a financial person, because looking somebody up on the internet without checking, is there anybody I know who knows this person? That's very unwise. And you don't need to do that, is the point. One of the things that many folks outside the US don't realize is the US has, embassies, consulates. They have state agencies whose job it is to bring business to the US. And there are resources, like, for example, in the UK, there's the British Embassy and there are a couple of consulates spread out over the US. And I have contacts with them and with other embassies and other consulates, and we can try and connect folks so that some of the free resources that are there can be, put in touch with the creatives. So you get this free source of support in addition to your professional advisors. And many of the professional advisors, me included, will try and help creatives if they know, well, this is the industry, this is the target. Let's see who we know in those locations that could maybe it's an art gallery owner, maybe it's somebody in fashion, etc. So I think that the takeaway really is, don't try and figure it out all on your own on internet. One lead can lead you to many other sources of help that are probably going to be more reliable than you trying to figure it out on your own.
And as you talk about things like, UK Chamber of Commerce and embassies, I assume that's the case. Thinking now we have a global audience listening, you could be coming from Tokyo, Sydney, Sao Paulo, Madrid. These resources, if you like, would be also available to truly international people looking to establish themselves in the US, right?
That's correct. We have the embassies are all in DC, but they're the smaller representations are through their consulates, which are in different cities, and so it's it may be better to have somebody who knows somebody at the consulate or an embassy helping you, as opposed to you just contacting them. So that, again, that's where your professional advisors can help.
Right.
because they have those contacts to say, we have a client, they want to come to the US, what can you do to help them?
Something else you just touched on, which I found very different from my home country in the UK when I first came to the US, is this passion, if you like, or this desire to want to help people. We might put that down to networking. You've touched on a few events, go to an art gallery, go to this, go to that. But this idea that, do you believe that as a result of that, that US clients, companies, entities are very open, increasingly open to overseas organizations, creatives in our case, doing business here in the US?
They are. They are. The America wants to have people investing here. The consulates and the embassies, like I said, many of them have missions which are directed at particular countries that they want to bring in. But yeah, they want to bring business to America. America is good. Is a place that always wants to support entrepreneurs, and I think it is a place where the networking. I can personally say I didn't really know how to network until I came to America, and the thing with America, it goes back to the point about customer service. If you are providing the best product that they are looking for, Americans are willing to pay for that, but you have to show, why is this a really good product, and then people will listen to you. You just have to understand that the American culture, I know it's not a monolith, but some things are the same no matter where you are in America, and that is, if you have a good product, you need to be able to tell your story, and you need to be able to articulate it well. And I don't want to necessarily jump ahead to other points, but culturally in America, Americans are much more open and willing than the Brits, for example, to say, hey, I have a great product, and it's great because ABC. They're not as shy about it. And so you have to sort of understand that you need to modify your approach sometimes to make it clear why you think your product is good.
Yeah, I mean, as a sort of an introvert myself, and many creatives are, you do need to push out of that, maybe that kind of character persona, but you learn as you go, right? There's an embrace that the American business culture embraces that. We don't need to be center stage in every meeting, on every call, but certainly push a little bit further than maybe we would do back home. But now we're talking about people. We were talking about ourselves. So I'd like to sort of like touch on, generally speaking, talent. If I'm a overseas creative, small, medium-sized agency looking to do business in the US, and I wanted to hire some talent locally, because I feel like I need that kind of local culture, because my client, I've just won a piece of business and they're looking for those US insights. Are there any differences between, let's say, hiring US contractors, FTEs, to the rest of the world? Given that that's a decision that somebody makes, what are the sort of like, watch outs in terms of hiring people, or is it fairly straightforward?
Well, I think there are two buckets to that answer. And one is, you do have to be aware of legal implications of entering into an agreement with somebody here if you don't have an entity. And if you're hiring from, let's say, hypothetically Brazil, and you're trying to collaborate with somebody in the US, you'll need to have a conversation with a lawyer and a tax person about, well, am I going to hire them as a contractor, or am I going to try and hire them as an employee? Generally, it's going to be problematic to try and hire them as an employee if you're not doing business here, okay? So let's assume it's a contractor. You have to be aware, is there something that you could get in trouble for because of the way that you're asking them to perform the services? Might they be viewed as an employee? That's just getting a little bit into the employee side of it, the legal side. But if we're talking about just, what do you need to be aware of from more of a high level, non-legal perspective, I think culturally, again, Americans tend to be more, they'll talk about their abilities and their skills. And most Northern Europeans, I know, will downplay their skill set. So what you have to be aware of from an American perspective is that what might be on paper presented to you by somebody, that might be a little bit more, I don't want to use the word exaggerated, but, they may be putting their very, very, very best foot forward, but the reality of the quality of what they're going to be able to produce for you might not be quite what it looks like on paper. And that's just because, the culture here is very much a sales culture. So people sell themselves really well, but you're going to have to do some vetting, really. And maybe that's one test project that you do with that person before you embark on a longer term relationship to see, well, can this person actually deliver the kind of quality that they've told me they can?
I love the thought, or it's a very interesting thought and insight, that notion of it being a sales culture. Because I think in some parts of the world, sales is kind of, wait, I'm a designer. I'm not in sales. Well, we are. We may be sort of further down the funnel of sales, but whatever we create has to sell something. So just that idea that the US is sort of at its foundation has got that sales mentality is super important to bear in mind as people jump over. Do you think, coming back to location, because you'd started to talk about, the US is like Europe, pick a country. And I'd like to go back to that to sort of dig into that a little bit more about, where is it the iconic cities of the US, the famous ones, the one where there's lots of business, of course, or these alternative cities, kind of like double click down into a second city, a third city. Do you have any thoughts on, and then going back to this, why pick a single location and do that really well? What are the advantages of that you've seen?
I think indeed we talked about, how vast and culturally different places are in the US. So you do have to ask yourself, what do I want? If I were to live in the US, where would I be happy? Do I want to live in a flat and an apartment? Do I want to live somewhere with land? Do I want to live somewhere where I have to drive? They sound like very basic questions, but it will affect where do you want to set up shop? And where you live doesn't necessarily have to be where you incorporate your business and start doing business, but then you'll have to travel to network. So I think if you go to one of the coastal cities like LA or New York, those are places that are going to be great for you if living in a frankly expensive city is something that you're okay with. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing that you think that will make me happy. On the other hand, if you're somebody who feels like I don't necessarily need to live in a big city, but I'd like to live somewhere where it's a short drive to a local farmer's market or a place where there are art galleries. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of places in the US you could go to where it's a university town and you can live just outside the university town and you can buy some land and have a farm and drive into the university and have an exhibition, into the university town and have an exhibition. I mean, there really is a lot of choice. And this is stating the obvious: climate. Do you want to live somewhere where it's warm? Mm-hmm. Or do you not mind living somewhere where the winters are pretty cold and you get snow, but you're okay with that because maybe you want to be in the Northeast so that you can drive to Boston and New York and DC within 2 hours. So these are choices that you have to make based on knowing yourself what's going to make you happy in the long term if you go down a route where you're physically going to be living here.
I also think, and that's a great way to think about modeling a new entity and where should that be. I love the idea of university towns and cities, because obviously as well, you've got potentially the school itself, and you've got kind of a sort of a entering the market new wave of kind of graduated talent in the creative space, or business development or social media marketing. So you could really connect with the school, as well as the glamorous cities where we all know that there's abundance of clients. I think if I was, so let's sort of play it out. If I was like, okay, I'm going to try and do work in the US for the first part of my sort of testing the water, I'm just going to do it remotely. I'm going to fly in, do some new business meetings, try and sort of win a project or two. And for the first period, I'm going to ask you to define what that period might look like. Or is it a monetary level? So at what point is there a tipping point? Is it revenue based? Is it time based? Is it just establishing yourself? But there must become a tipping point where you think, right, let's go for it.
I think it can be several of those factors, to be honest. If you're coming here because suddenly you start getting 30, 40, 50+% of your customers are from the US, you might decide, I want to come and spend more time here. If you're seriously thinking about moving to the US, you have to be comfortable that the US may be culturally very different to what you're used to. And so I don't think it would be wise to decide, I'm going to set up in the US having never visited the US, right? So sometimes making those trips is a good thing, just to see, even if it's to meet one or two customers and you spend a week or two in a location. There are obviously legal implications for traveling back and forth and doing business in the US. So one of the first things that anybody who's really serious about doing business in the US, which might include living in the US, one of the first things you really have to do is to speak to an immigration lawyer to understand what are my options. Because living in the US, you can't just turn up. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but you can't just turn up and buy a house here and decide you want to set up a business. So you should get immigration advice on the front end. And if you decide, I've got so many sales here, I'm going to set up an entity, either you're going to have to be here running that, in which case you have to, have the right immigration paperwork, or you've got to hire somebody on the ground. And that comes back to what we were talking about earlier. How are you going to find somebody who really does live up to the promises they make? How are you going to monitor them from a distance? But I do think at some point it's worth asking yourself, would it make sense to be in the US? And the other thing is, if you're doing business with using a company that's outside the US, but you're contracting with a customer in the US, there can be advantages of being in the US from a legal protection standpoint. And so I don't want to get too in the weeds, because I don't want to be giving individual legal advice to anybody, but you understand, if somebody sues you because they're not happy with whatever you delivered and you don't have an entity in the US, they're going to go and try and sue your entity in Brazil or wherever you are, Britain. And
I think the thought of having the necessary protections for both ways is very important. You've mentioned an immigration lawyer. If I could just go back to that, step one, immigration lawyer. What would be let's say that's in place. Step 2, 3, 4, is it a US accountant, a US bank account? Do I need to register? Where do I register? Everybody talks about, when we first came here, it was all about Delaware. So, but we've never had an office in Delaware. So what would be aside from the immigration lawyer, second, third, fourth things that we should be thinking about even when we're doing remote business?
I think, honestly, this is going to sound like I'm trying to just promote lawyers, but I do think the lawyer is the number one thing, because you need to make sure that even if you haven't set up yet, that your contracts are done in a way to minimize, issues with a customer complaining that it's not up to snuff, And so you need a lawyer, you need the immigration lawyer. Then normally what I do is I have a conversation with a client, asking them various things about what they want to achieve, and that helps to drive which state should they set up in. But I do that in conjunction with a CPA. That's what they call an accountant here. And it's critical to have an accountant. And we have lots of accounting people that we know through our networks. So you don't need to go and independently find an accountant. If you don't have one, we can introduce you to people. And that goes hand in hand really with the legal setup, because we want to try and make sure that where you decide to set up makes sense for you from a tax perspective, based on what you're doing back home, and from a legal perspective. Once you have those two things sorted out, then you can have your entity created in the US, and then after that you get various bits of paperwork that you will need in order to open a bank account in the US under the name of that entity. And then a couple of things you have to also get in place. It might be a local business permit. That's pretty small potatoes in the bigger scheme of things, and insurance. But once you've got those few things running, you're pretty good to go. And so then it's really a question of going out and making sales, making your name known in the network.
I think that as a checklist, and we'll definitely add this at the end of this talk, just because as a creative, and again, I may be a small, medium-sized studio somewhere in the world, as a founder-led creative studio, that's his or her background. They understand the creative product, they understand design, they understand how to pitch that. There's this whole other space that you're outlining that we didn't go to school to study, and in other locations around the world it will be very different. So to have a quote partner in that space, starting with the lawyer, that then kind of almost waterfalls down to all the other things that would be required as a successful entity to start really doing business here. And do you think it's linear? Do you think that someone, kind of moving towards the last question, do you think that you could remotely start to sort of test the water without making any firm commitments, and then strategically start to talk to the kind of foundational services, including yourself, to kind of run things together? Or is it like, do 12 months at this, see if it's successful, and then move to the more professional services and entity setup?
I think it can be done at the same time, to be honest. But sometimes it's a question of budget, right? If you have a really big contract and if you're generating hundreds of thousands of dollars for some reason immediately in the US, then it may well be worth just getting ahead with the entity formation, and getting your contracts together under American law. So I think it doesn't have to be not one size fits all, but I think where I have seen a difficulty is where a client doesn't quite know where they want to set up, doesn't quite know where are my customers, right? And then it's very difficult to say, well, why don't you start here? If you know, for example, there's going to be technology that you need, and you're going to have to hire software engineers in the US, there are some places where it makes sense to incorporate, right? Because well, I know there's going to be engineers I can find easily located here and here. You don't need to find the best solution. You don't need to find the perfect solution, and you don't necessarily need to spend tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars doing research to find out which state is the best state, right? Sometimes it is just through doing. Starting small, doing one or two contracts, and then networking. And but you do need to make sure that a couple of things are in place, like the insurance, like your business permit, like the entity and your basic contract that you're going to use, your legal contract with customer services. And theoretically, you don't really need anybody here, but from a practical perspective, you might, because who's going to go and deposit the money in a US bank account otherwise? Things like that. And there are services that you can get here. They call them fractional, like fractional CFOs, chief financial officers, or fractional legal officers. There are these services so that if you don't necessarily have the budget or anyone here, they can take on that role as you grow. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to think about it. And I suppose, let's say I'm not a small, medium-sized agency. I don't have that sort of depth of an entity wherever it may be in the world. I'm a freelancer.
Yeah.
And flip the script in a way that freelancers are starting to do work in the US and looking for those clients and brands and organizations, but they're really not at the stage in their career or their life to start to register new entities yet. Is it any advice for freelancers around the world looking to sort of make that first step as well in a kind of a smaller way rather than an entity registration?
Understand. I think at the end of the day, when you're producing something, your goal is to get paid. So there are some things, this is not even really so much legal advice, but you have to make sure that you have set up your process on paper in a way that is going to maximize the chance that you will get 100% of what you thought you were going to get paid for that service. And so it may be that you need to ask for a larger deposit upfront from the customer. And I say this because of the point I made earlier that America is very service oriented, and people will come back to you and say, well, I'm not quite happy about, the framing on this picture or something like that. I would like you to fix that. And maybe your contract made it clear what was the standard that you were going to deliver. Maybe it didn't. But the risk that you have with doing business in America, if you're not clear on the standard, especially with creative works where it's can be subjective to some degree, you might have to spell out quite clearly what are you delivering so that you minimize the chance that the client refuses to pay because they're not quite happy with some fringe aspect of it. And that ties in with you have to make sure that your contract with your client is the most beneficial to you in terms of getting as much money as you can up front to reduce the risk that you spend months doing something and then the client refuses to pay at the end of it because they're not happy.
I can vouch for that. Understanding the terms of service, the contracts. I came from a country that's more around, I wouldn't call it a handshake, but verbal promises. In the US, it's very black and white, signatures, and that's actually a really tight ship. That's how, but from a country that maybe speaking about myself, doesn't always like to talk about the money up front. Like this is another skill set that needs to be sort of a muscle that needs to be sort of turned on to overcome those fears about talking about the budget, the payment terms, what are the deliverables, and if we're all happy, let's sign, and don't start the work before we've signed,
Yes.
type of thing.
Absolutely. And it is, to my point, it's just in the creative industries, it is so much more difficult if you're going to give a lot of leeway to the customer to modify things. It may just not be profitable at the end of it if you haven't put those guardrails in place previously. We'll do up to X number of modifications, but then that's it. Making sure the customer has approved a design, before you go and print, for example, and you've got proof they approved it, things like that. That they sound legal issues, and they should be documented in that way in a document, but they are really more practical things that you need to think about. What's my process? How can I build in safeguards for myself?
And to finish on because this whole podcast is not about, this is about encouraging people, isn't it? Not to give them that's like, wow, there's so much to think about. But to finish on a positive, that international, and obviously this whole program is not going to go into, we're in a very different world this year than we were last year, 5 years ago, and we will be in a very different world in the next few years. But the idea, so that's not the rabbit hole of this call. The positive outtakes of doing business in the US for creative professionals, small agencies, freelancers, there's an abundance of work here that you will see with different entities that you help establish themselves in the US. Any final thoughts about that in terms of the opportunities that the US can offer creative organizations?
I think I agree with you that there are tremendous opportunities here. One of the obvious things is, yes, America's massive and it's the size of Europe, but everybody speaks English. So there are fewer language issues, which enables you to target more states and a wider geographic area than if you'd had to try and cover the same area in Europe. And I think you can use that to your advantage. And just, obviously I'm not an immigration lawyer, but I can share, for example, the US has visa types for creative people, a separate category for creative people. And so in a way, that's also a signal that those kinds of people are valued. And, really, America is a place where if you make the right contacts, you can do very well for yourself if you go and, go out and sell yourself. Literally, it's a sales culture. And it doesn't mean you have to be super extrovert. I'm not super extrovert. You're not an extrovert either, James, but sometimes you should have to put your hat on, pretend it's almost like the school play. I'm going to go out and do this thing for a day, and it is a place where you can do very well for yourself.
Great advice, Manori. And we're just going to sort of finish on asking you, if people want to get in touch, which I'm sure they will, if they're thinking of making that move, where can they find you?
That's fantastic. They can look me up, Manori de Silva, attorney, and it will turn up with my bio at Clark Hill. And they can look on the website. And I think you're going to provide my email contact, but otherwise it's mdesilva@clarkhill.com. And they can reach out to me by email, and I will reach back out to them to see, what they're looking for and how we could try and help them.
Great. If you're happy, we'll absolutely, to everybody listening, we'll absolutely provide your email. Of course, we can find anybody anywhere these days on all the social channels, but that's just great to know. Well, Manori, thank you again for giving us such great value and advice to creatives around the world who might be thinking of making that first step into the US, whether they're a freelancer, a small business, a medium-sized business, just some real practical advice there in the areas that we don't specialize in as creatives. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, Manori.
Thank you, James. It's been an honor. Appreciate it.
Super cool.
Okay. Thank you.